Welcome to this lesson on the Tableau Certified Data Analyst exam. We're going to talk about writing aggregate functions. And so here's what we're going to cover in a little more detail. First, we're going to look at the difference between aggregate functions and row level functions. Then we'll talk about some rules for aggregate calculations so that you don't get error messages when you're trying to do those. And then we'll look at the most frequently used aggregate calculations: sum, min, max, average, median, count, and count distinct. And then finally, we'll do a demo. So here is the aggregate versus row level. What's the difference between these two? So row level calculations are performed on individual record level in your source data. And so they're essentially adding another column to your source data set so that row by row, you're adding that extra column, right? So it's like in Excel, if you have a table of data and you add a calculated column, it's the same thing in Tableau. For each value, for each row in your data set, you're adding another column with data. And so you're doing that before any aggregation occurs. So it's like creating a new field in your data set based on the existing fields. On the other hand, with aggregations, you are performing data calculations on collections of rows to summarize the data. And so, for example, you could use calculation like sum. So sum actually doesn't make any sense on a single value because it's adding up a value by itself just gives you the same number. But if you have 20 rows that you're summing up, then that will give you the sum of those 20, one field in those 20 rows, right? And so we'll see that more in the demo. And so we're going to be, with aggregated calculations, you're combining data across multiple rows to summarize that data in some way. It might be to get the sum, the average, the max. There are other calculations. So that's aggregate versus row level. Now let's just talk about a couple of rules with aggregate calculations. The big rule is that you can't combine aggregated and disaggregated values. So for example, if I do the sum of price and then I try and multiply it by the items, that won't work. And if you think about why, it makes sense because suppose you have 20 rows that are in your group, and so you sum up all the values of price, right? And so now you have a single value, the sum of price. And so how would you then multiply that single value by the individual items? It doesn't really make sense to do that, and so Tableau won't allow you to do that. Since you have 20 values for items, but only a single value for sum of price, you can't multiply that one value times the 20 values in any meaningful way. So Tableau returns an error. Then the other thing is aggregated calculations always return measures. So that's even true if you're using like the attrib function on a dimension. It will still give you back a measure, and that's always going to be the result. So that's a couple things to note with aggregate calculations. Now let's talk about the most frequently used aggregation functions. The first is sum, and so this is very simple. It's just adding up all of the numbers that are in the current group for the aggregation. Then we have the min, giving you the smallest value, and if that's a date, that would be the earliest date. If it's a text field, a string field, it would give you alphabetically the first one. That's that one. Then the max, which is the opposite of min, gives you the highest value. Then average, so that's going to add up all the values, ignoring the null values, and divide by the total number of rows that are included in that. And so that'll give you the average value. Then you have the median, which if you're not familiar, median is ordering the values from least to greatest and then taking the middle value or the average of the middle two values to give you a sense of what the typical central value is in the data set. You can look up the definition of median if you're not familiar with it. And then finally, we have count, which counts up the number of non-null values in the column that you select. And then count distinct, which gives you the number of unique values. So for example, if you wanted to know how many customers are in my data set, you could do a count distinct on the customer ID to find that out. If you find in the demo I'm going too quickly or too slowly, feel free to adjust the speed of the video. And now I'm going to switch over. And so here's the documentation on aggregate calculations. And now I'm going to go and do a demo where we look at some of these. So I'm going to add orders from the sample superstore data, and I'm going to do a new worksheet. And now whenever I add a measure to the view, it will automatically do an aggregate calculation. So if I drag, for example, sales into the view, this adds up all of the values of sales in my entire data set. This is not very interesting because I don't have any dimensions in the view. But if I, for example, added the customer name, now I see, and I add all members, it's going to be a lot, I see the total sum of sales for a particular customer. And so this says this particular person had $886 in sales. If I view the individual data, you can see that these are the particular sales values that this person had. And so they're all added up and we get a total of 886. So that is sum of sales by customer name. If I was doing this in SQL, it would be select customer name, comma, sum of sales from Superstore table, group by customer name. That would be what it would look like. And so we get a single value. So that's one way we can do it. We can also create calculated fields with aggregation. So I could do create calculated fields. I could do sum of sales and then like this. And so now if I double click that and add it to the view, and I also add customer name and put this in the same format, you see I actually get the same answers that I had before. The only difference is now I'm doing ag sum of sales. And so ag just means we've already aggregated it. So we'll just put this ag in front of the formula because we don't aggregate twice. So it just says ag sum of sales to say the calculation's already aggregated, so we don't need to repeat it. So that's a calculation using an aggregated function. And now I'm going to demonstrate what I was talking about before, where we cannot do like an operation that includes a combination of aggregated and non-aggregated. So if I try to do like this, I see the calculation contains errors, and it says we can't mix aggregated and non-aggregated functions. What we can do would be to do sum of sales divided by sum of profit. And so this adds up all the values of sales and then divides them by all the values of the sum of profit, right, for the current level of detail in the view. So if we take, for example, this case again, we see in the full data, we would add up all of these numbers and then divide by the sum of all of these numbers to get 7. So that's sum. Now let's take a look at some other options for aggregation. We could do, if I move in here, I can do min, max, and I can just change very easily through this menu. So I right click, do measure, and so I can switch to average, and I can switch to median, count distinct, and see all those different results based on those different calculations. And so now I'm going to remove this and also remove this. And before I mentioned that we often would want to know, for example, how many unique orders or how many unique customers. And so if that's something you want to do, I'd create a calculated field and I'd say distinct or unique customers. And then I could do count D on the customer ID. And so this gives me the number of unique customers. Click OK, add it to the view. And then I will add maybe the segment so that I can see the number of unique customers for each segment. And I see that consumer had 409 unique customers, corporate had 236 unique customers, and home office had 148 unique customers. Now, if I click here and go to view data, you see that this always just returns 1 when I look at it row by row, because obviously there's only one customer in a given row. So that is an introduction to aggregation in Tableau. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Thank you.